You know how sometimes you're going along in your life and all of a sudden you stop to kind of take stock of what's happening and you realize that nothing much. Everything's kind of the same. It's a little monotonous. You're just kind of going along like a little bit of a sleepwalker. What is going on? Well, the difference between life and a good novel is that in life, there's no inciting incident to change things up. That's the huge difference between your life and a good book. And all of you who talk about being the main character in your own life, maybe you're just missing a really good inciting incident. Not just any inciting incident, because not all inciting incidents are created equal. In this episode of the How to Be an Author podcast, we're going to be talking all about inciting incidents. What is an inciting incident in your book or in your storytelling? What kind of things need to happen before you actually unleash this inciting incident? What makes a good inciting incident or a bad one? What are some of the inciting incident mistakes? And what needs to happen after the inciting incident? If you are a Writing Coach on Demand member, yay, you'll be getting bonus materials and a bonus podcast as well. You'll be getting, amongst other things, an inciting incident checklist, and we'll be doing some story sprints to work on your creativity. We're going to be coming up with the perfect inciting incident for your particular character and your specific story. So thank you for joining me. Let's get started. If you're a writer dreaming of becoming a successful author, join me, writing coach Karena Akhavein, on the How to Be an Author podcast, your weekly source for writing information, inspiration, and motivation. Hello, and welcome back to the How to Be an Author podcast. This is where you find out those little writing hacks that can help you totally transform your story for the better. This is where you get unstuck. This is where you get these ideas that you'd heard about, those writing tips that probably you read somewhere before and that you heard other writers talking about, but you never quite knew how to implement them, how to act on them so that they actually change your writing for the better. I try to make this as approachable as possible. And as always, please feel free to reach out to me via email or book that 15-minute discovery call if you have this huge pressing question that you need answered. Also, if you want to work with me, the Writing Coach on Demand program is such a great economical deal. You don't have to pay for hour by hour writing coach hours, but you still get access to me, your writing coach, Karena Akhavein. And you'll get tons of bonus materials and you'll get discounts on things site-wide, including my courses, which is a really great deal considering that we have a very exciting course coming up very, very soon. So let's talk about the inciting incident. I think this is one of the most misunderstood elements in storytelling. Essentially, the inciting incident is what would be called by Joseph Campbell, for example, when we're talking about monomyth or these story archetypes, we're talking about the call to adventure in the hero's journey in any case. The call to adventure. Think about that. It's just a call. It's not yet the adventure. This is, put as simply as possible, I guess we would say, the inciting incident is an event that occurs that is something that is going to impact your protagonist. This event occurs near the beginning of your story, and this is going to set the story moving in a different direction than it would have been moving before, which is usually kind of like an unsatisfying and boring direction, kind of like the example I was talking about when you're in your life feeling like you're just kind of stumbling through, not doing anything much. The word inciting is used because this event incites your protagonist to act. This is the really important thing because you know how so many of us, including writers, where we're like, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write a book. I'm going to finish my book. And then we don't act. You know, where we're like, I'm going to start a business. I'm going to start doing this or that. And we don't act. So this is what a protagonist does. They act. That's the difference. We had an episode on main character energy, and if you want a refresh on that, you might want to listen to that episode again. But think about that. Your protagonist hasn't been acting the way they're supposed to. This inciting incident is going to set the plot into motion, forcing your main character to act in a new course of action. They're pushed into it because this is the important thing about an inciting incident. Usually it's not an independent decision that your character made to start acting, right? The inciting incident, if well done, is something that upsets the balance within the world that your main character is inhabiting at the beginning of the story. Like most people, even if they're low-key miserable, they wouldn't change their situation because there's a certain comfort to sitting around in the same old, kind of uncomfortable, but not, mega painful situation. Let's take the example of someone who's in an unhappy marriage. They might stay in that unhappy marriage for years, even though it's not satisfying them. They'll make excuses. They'll say, I'm there for the kids. They'll say, I won't have any money if I get out. But what is going to take is an inciting incident, like meeting someone new or moving to a new place and gaining some new passion in life. That's what it's going to take for that character or for that person to start acting in a different direction that is often less comfortable, right? So that's going to be really important too. We're going to be thinking about not just an inciting incident that happens and then the character is up and going. It's hard to act. It's not easy. It takes your world being upset and not being able to fall back into those same comfortable patterns for a character or yourself to actually start acting. So let's talk about a few different types of inciting actions in general. These are just the most general categories because you have some choices here. So there is such a thing as a causal inciting action. This is an inciting action that kind of derives from a deliberate choice that was made about the protagonist or by the protagonist. Like this is somebody saying, okay, you're going to go to this new school because you acted a certain way. Or the protagonist going, wow, I've hit rock bottom by, burning my passport and, abandoning my kids. Now I need to do something, right? So there is some kind of a semi-deliberate choice, but I think that the important thing to say here is that your character, when they did this thing or when this thing was thrust upon them, they didn't quite realize that this was going to change their life as much as it does, right? So that's really important. It's rare for a character to have nothing going on before, no problems, and to all of a sudden say, I just made a decision. I'm going to turn my life around. I'm going to go on this journey. No, something has to happen for them to do that. So the next kind of inciting action would be the coincidental one, right? This is your protagonist is in the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the wrong time or the wrong place at the right time, whatever you want it to be. But this is a coincidence. Now, this is one of the only things in your book that I will allow you as your writing coach to have be coincidental. Because in general, I want your protagonist to be acting decisively, whether they're right or wrong. I want them to be making these decisions. And there are too many endings of books that happen because of some kind of deus ex machina, where some deity jumps out from the wings and saves everyone. Now, that was something that could work in Shakespeare, but even then, I don't think it worked that well. I think it's much more satisfying if things happen because of the actions of your protagonist, right? However, an inciting action, yes, that can be a coincidence. Think about it. A meteorite strikes somebody's house and now they have to go do something. Think of the Wizard of Oz with the tornado. That is a great example of a coincidental inciting action. This tornado hitting the house launches everything else. Or you can have, look at the letter that comes from Hogwarts for Harry Potter. all of these kind of coincidental inciting actions, though the letter I would say is kind of slightly a causal inciting action just because it was due to his parents being sorcerers, blah, blah, blah. But coincidental inciting actions, like I'm thinking things like a car accident, but sometimes again, look at this and see, is my character responsible for the car accident or not? Because that's going to kind of shape and, meld your storytelling into a specific thing. Because this is the thing about inciting actions. They don't exist in a vacuum. Your inciting action really should be very suited to your character and your story. And we're going to be talking much more about that in this episode. I think that's really crucial. Too many of us just kind of throw in some inciting incident and then we're just like, that's it. Now we don't have to talk about this ever again. Well, that's a lost opportunity. Finally, you've got an ambiguous inciting incident. And this is something where the inciting incident happens and is not fully explained why this situation came about. You're not quite sure whether your protagonist now finds themselves in this situation by absolute chance, random, or is it by choice? Oftentimes, I feel that these work if you've got something of an unreliable narrator, and also if you've got kind of this mystery that you're setting up this inciting incident. And one of the mysteries in the book is, how did we get to this point? That could be something very useful. And I'll give you an example kind of that as we go along. But this is something where you start in this weird situation that you can tell is going to launch this character into a completely different path, but you don't know how they got there and exactly why. And that might be one of the things. So your story then kind of goes in two directions, right? Flashbacks to figure out how we got here and forward to see where we go from there. That's kind of an interesting thing. Actually, I'll give you the example right now in the Gabriel Garcia Marquez story, where the story starts off saying that this character is facing the firing squad and that it was due to, basically, he remembers as he's facing the firing squad that this time when he went to get some ice with his father. So you've got these two mysteries of what's going to happen next. Why is he in front of the firing squad? But what is this deal with he and the father going to get ice? Why is that so important, right? So I think that's really, really key to look at. So what needs to happen before the inciting incident? I've mentioned that the inciting incident has to take place early on in your story, within the first act. Why does this have to be? Don't you have creative freedom? Why do I have to do this the way writing coach said? Because if you don't do it in the first act, there's a pretty big chance that your story might be structurally confusing to your reader. And you do not want this. You want your reader to kind of get this promise from you that things are going to be happening. And then you want it to start moving forward. You want the story to move because an inciting incident incites the rest of the things to happen. So that's just a simpler way of setting it up. If you find a really cool way to play with flashbacks and flash forwards and all that stuff later, by all means, be my guest. But I just want you to build a structure to the story that's clear at first, and then you can do that yoga with it that I talk about with your story spine. But let's know what our inciting incident is. So what needs to happen, though? We don't have too much time before the inciting incident, but there are a couple things that I would recommend you do and that you establish before we have this. The first really important thing that I want before the inciting incident, and some authors can do this in just a few well-written words, is I want you to set the story's tone. And oftentimes the inciting incident really goes very far into helping to further establish the story's tone for sure. But really I want to know, is this story going to be happy? Is it going to be sad? Is it going to be dark? Is it going to be comical? Is it going to be moralistic? Is it going to, basically what do I expect from this story? I kind of want that established before the inciting incident hits. And that's something that really you can do within just a few words, sentences, or paragraphs. I also want to know who my main character is, who my protagonist is, who's going to be affected by this inciting incident. I kind of want to know what their everyday life was before this inciting incident hit. Now, in Hollywood movies, sometimes it's just a few seconds. You see the character hanging by their fingernails from a cliff. And so a lot of writers tell me, well, Hollywood doesn't do this. Hollywood actually does, because with visual clues, with expressions, with little details of how the character is dressed, how they look, how the tone of their voice is, you know a lot more about that character in seconds than you do in words. So think about, how do I get my audience or my reader to know who this character is, know what their everyday life is, what are their strengths and weaknesses, what do they care about, what do you think they might want, and what's going to be upset by this inciting incident. So in my upcoming book, Gone to Ground, I basically show my character, and she's sitting in her closet recording a podcast. And she is really locked in here in her safe little world, but there's this barn jacket of her dad's hanging there. And she's got a problematic relationship with her dad. And you can tell this from the way she kind of feels about this jacket literally hanging over her head. And you can see that this is a character who's hidden herself away. She's hidden who she is. That's really important. And then the inciting incident comes pretty soon after that. And it's something that probably is one of these hybrid inciting actions or incidents where the thing that happens is something that she helped precipitate by being the person she is. But also it has to do with things that happened in the past. And it has to do with an accident that happens, something that happens completely, relatively randomly. So you'll see, if you read the book, you'll figure out all of those details. I don't want to give away anything, because one of the big things in my inciting incident is that the true reason behind why the inciting incident happens when it does, that's only revealed at the end. So that's a way to play with your inciting incident. I think that's really, really important. But I definitely want to know who your character is and why I should care about them, why I should care about whether they go on this journey or not. That's really important to have before the inciting incident happens. So let's talk about what makes a good inciting incident and, what makes a not so good inciting incident. So remember, the inciting incident inspires the protagonist's motivations, not just at the beginning, throughout the story. So this is really important. The inciting incident needs to be earth-shattering for them. So, and this, people often think, okay, well, my inciting incident needs to be this massive event with lots of loss of life, exploding buildings, plane crashes, cataclysmic events. No. You can write a story that is purely emotionally or psychologically driven, where the inciting incident is something so simple as the character stubbing their toe and finding, a googly eye on the ground, and this sets them off on this search for, their kid who just disappeared, or, it sets them off on finding their creativity that they had lost, something like that. Think about how the same inciting incident can mean so many different things for different characters. So see how your inciting incident is really enmeshed in who your character is. What's going to happen, the same inciting incident can force different characters to act in completely different ways. That's really, really important. And so many times, as I mentioned, you want the compelling inciting incident to make your character take actions they wouldn't have otherwise throughout the novel, throughout the story. And what does that mean? It means it's important enough to upset everything, make them reconsider how they've been living their life, make them see that they can't go on this way. It needs to have a sense of urgency. So this is something that's really crucial. Too many times I have writers come to me with storylines that are of a nebulous timeline. And sometimes the story kind of drifts on for years. I'm like, no, there's got to be a sense of urgency. I try to make them frame their story in something where you only have a certain amount of time to achieve your goal. Right? So in terms of a big, massive thriller, it will be, the clock's ticking down and the bad guy is going to blow up the world. But in a kind of more emotional story, it could be, my kid goes away to sleepaway camp, in 2 days, and I need to find out whether they actually deserved to be suspended from school or not, sort of thing. So think about how that goes. Or the divorce papers will be final, in 36 hours. How can I find out whether we were supposed to be divorced or not after I found my husband's wedding ring with a bow around it on my pillow that morning? Things like that. Think about how an emotional thing can hit your character. And you want it to also have the urgency, as I said, that we have a timeline. Something bad will happen. What are the stakes if my character does not respond to this inciting incident? Really crucial, because this is one of the really important things. This is one of the big mistakes I see writers doing, is that they have the inciting incident. Great, great, great. It's got the urgency to it. Okay, cool. But their character just kind of like, this inciting incident falls in their lap and their character's like, okay, doop-de-doo, well, that's it. I guess I'm going to go do this now. I think it's more realistic for your character to hesitate a little bit, at least, to have some kind of internal battle with themselves, raise the tension and the suspense of whether they're actually going to go on this journey, and make it a journey that is challenging enough that you don't know how they're going to do. That's really, really important, right? So the inciting incident is going to leave us with questions we want answered. It's going to hook the reader because it's a compelling scenario. It is something where the reader is like, whoa, this is crazy. What does this mean? What does this mean for this character that I'm just starting to get into? We want the questions. What's the character going to do next? What does this mean? What does this imply? What's the possibility behind this? That's the sort of thing that makes a good inciting incident. And also, a good inciting incident really has to go with the story's tone. Remember how I said that I want you to establish the tone before you start, but I really want the inciting incident to go with the story's tone. So if we've set up a tone that is a little bit sinister, if all of a sudden we have like this happy puppy parade coming through, let's see how we can have that go with the tone, because that's going to be kind of weird if it doesn't. So if you have gone so against your reader's expectations in a way that's going to disappoint them rather than thrill them, I think that that's something that you really need to think about. So what are some of the biggest inciting incident mistakes that I see? The first one is that there's kind of a wrong timeline. You need to make sure that your inciting incident takes place during the timeline of the story you're telling. So let me explain that, because this is something that many people don't quite realize. So of course, you can sow the seeds of your inciting incident earlier than the timeline, but really, I don't think it works to have an inciting incident be a past event that others refer to, like 100 years ago, King Harold made this rule, and now 100 years later, our character has decided that she absolutely must act against it and go on this adventure. No, that's kind of crazy, right? There's not that visceral truth. There's not that urgency. You want the audience to experience this inciting incident happening in real time in the work. I think that that's pretty crucial. Unless you really find a brilliant way to make it work otherwise, I think that that's really, really important, to have that inciting incident be something that's going to be in the timeline that works and that you move forward from that, even if we have the backwards and forwards, like I mentioned. Also, the inciting incident, if it doesn't happen in the first act, I really think this is a big problem. And I know I mentioned this earlier in the podcast, but definitely have it take place in the first act. If not, what are we doing? Too many times I see authors having this long exposition of what their main character is like and what is happening and everything else. And yeah, that can be kind of interesting, but if that character is not driven to get something and that character is not goal-oriented right from the beginning, I don't know why we're still reading past a few chapters. And of course, you can have a small inciting incident that is just big enough to keep the characters going towards the next thing that is the next mistake. And some people call that another inciting incident. I would say sure, but I would say that that's a series of actions or obstacles that derive from what happened after the first inciting incident. So that's what's really important too. I think that one big mistake is that people make the inciting incident a little bit too weak. Like the character reads a letter and they feel kind of bad about it. So they're going to go do this. And then they're like, and I sat around wondering what to do next. Oh my God. So many times I see this or a version of this, and that's not enough to sustain your character and keep them acting throughout the course of your story. You can't have an inciting incident that's weak. So even if it's something subtle, like I mentioned the Google eye on the floor that your character finds that they stub their toe against, but that symbolically is huge to your character. It has to be. It needs to drive your character urgently. It needs to turn their life upside down. So that's really important. Realize how your character has the inciting incident really tailored to who they are and what they thought they wanted and what they need and what their goal might be. It's really crucial. Something that's going to bother me is not going to bother you. Something that's going to turn my whole life upside down is going to do nothing to you. That's really crucial. So that's why I'm saying establish who your character is first. Very, very important. And definitely make sure that that inciting incident, I want to keep remembering what that was. I don't want it to be a one and done where it's like, oh, this thing happens. And now towards the middle of the story, we've almost forgotten why my character's there. No. Your character has to keep reminding themselves that I'm doing this because of that. Even if their search morphs into something else, it still needs to drive that story pretty directly. So what happens after the inciting incident? This is exactly kind of what we want to talk about more, is how our character reacts to the inciting event. They need to keep reacting and acting, because this is the thing that's going to give us more about their personality. It's going to tell us more about what their goals are. It's going to tell us about how strong they are or what their weaknesses might be. We are going to keep learning about this character as they act after this inciting incident. Basically, the whole rest of your story is the after the inciting incident. That is what you need to develop. And any obstacle that comes forward is happening because your character decided to go on this adventure, which they didn't know if they would actually be successful at it. But that's really important to show them reacting and taking the risk of doing something because that inciting incident was so powerful for them and raised the stakes for them in their life. Got it? I hope this was helpful. I think it might have been, because I think many times we know that we're supposed to have the inciting incident and we kind of mess it up. So if you are a writing coach on demand person, this is when you head to the bonus episode, yay. And after that, you will do your worksheets and you'll see your checklist. I think is going to be super helpful. If you are not a writing coach on demand person, you can, of course, join anytime. And if you join this week, you'll get access to this stuff. If you didn't join this week, you'll be getting access to other stuff. But you will have access to the bonus episodes. It's just your worksheets won't be accessible right away, but I am planning on making a bank of worksheets for later. So that's in process. And if you decide that you don't want to be a writing coach on demand person right away, even though it's less than $1 a day, you might be holding out for the course from idea to published in 6 months. And that's going to be really exciting because you will have a whole lesson on inciting incidents. But if you do your worksheets, you're going to be even more prepped for it. And it's going to be something that you're going to know what you're doing, and it's going to help you to move forward in writing your book even faster. Thank you so much for joining me. I look forward to being with you next time on the How to Be an Author podcast. If you have any pressing writing-related questions or would like to be featured on the How to Be an Author podcast, please feel free to reach out on my website, creativeandwritingcoach.com.